Chapter 6, Lesson 4 of Geometry, and we want to take a look now at these special parallelograms that we have. You remember when we're classifying these quadrilaterals, we have two pairs of parallel sides, which makes them parallelograms, and then we had some additional questions to ask. We looked at the four sides. If they were congruent, we had a rhombus, so this would be a special type of parallelogram. If it has four right angles, then it's a rectangle, so we looked at those special types of parallelograms. And if the answer to both of those was yes, meaning it's a rhombus, and a rectangle, that's a square. So what we want to do now in this lesson is to take a look at some of the characteristics of those rhombus and square, or rhombus and rectangle parallelograms, much like we did with the parallelograms to begin with. Now, the important thing to remember here is that all of the characteristics that we've already talked about, in other words, in a parallelogram, we know that the opposite angles are congruent, the opposite sides are congruent, and the diagonals bisect each other. All of those characteristics continue to be true of every figure that we talk about in this lesson. So we have those three things that are already true about these figures we're going to talk about, and then we're going to have some additional things that are true with these special parallelograms. So let's take a look at those. The additional characteristic of a rhombus is not only are the opposite sides congruent because it's a parallelogram, not only are the opposite angles congruent because it's a parallelogram, and not only do the diagonals bisect each other because it's a parallelogram, in a rhombus the diagonals actually bisect the two angles of the rhombus as well. So this angle here, if you draw this diagonal, it cuts this angle directly in half. It bisects those two angles. So this angle and this angle are congruent, and this angle and this angle are congruent as well. Now, if I drew this other diagonal, remember as a parallelogram, it's going to cut each other in half, right? And in addition, it's going to cut this angle in half as well. So the additional characteristic here is that the rhombus, the diagonal cuts the two angles in half. Okay, so that's the first thing. The second thing about the diagonals of a rhombus is that they are perpendicular. So again, I'm going to run through this, keep running through this so you get the idea. The parallelogram, because a rhombus is a parallelogram, the opposite angles are congruent, the opposite sides are congruent, the diagonals bisect each other. We also just learned that the diagonals bisect the angles, and in addition to that, the diagonals are perpendicular to each other. So these angles that are created inside are right angles. Now this is very important to remember because now what is created right inside here? Okay, what you create then are some nice little right triangles, and you remember in right triangles we can always use Pythagorean theorem to figure out the lengths of sides. So that's going to be something that you're going to need to do, and remember that you have these right triangles now because these are perpendicular, which is going to allow you to apply what you know about right triangles, i.e. the Pythagorean theorem. So these are additional characteristics that are true of a rhombus. So the rhombus keeps the characteristics of a parallelogram, opposite sides congruent, opposite angles congruent, and diagonals bisect each other. And in addition to that, because all the sides are equal, the diagonals are going to bisect the angles, and the diagonals are also going to be perpendicular to each other. The other special parallelogram that we looked at was if we had four right angles and we had a rectangle. And there's only one additional thing that's true about a rectangle beyond the fact of the characteristics of a parallelogram. And what's true about the diagonals of a rectangle is that they are equal in length. So if you have a rectangle, the length of this diagonal and the length of this diagonal are exactly the same length. Okay, so in addition to keeping the characteristics of a parallelogram, opposite sides congruent, opposite angles congruent, and diagonals bisecting each other, in a rectangle the diagonals actually are congruent as well. Okay, so those are the additional characteristics of a rhombi and rhombi and a rectangle. Now, to tie that all together, a square. Because a square is a rhombus and it's also a rectangle, so a square keeps all of the characteristics that we've talked about all the way down. So as a parallelogram, a square has opposite angles congruent, yes, opposite sides congruent, and the diagonals bisect each other. Because a square is a rhombus, the diagonals also bisect the angles, and the diagonals are also perpendicular. And because it's a rectangle, the diagonals are also equal in length. So the square has 6 characteristics that are true and those 6 relationships are true in every square. So you're going to need to remember all of those relationships in order to then write equations in order to determine angles or determine lengths of sides. Okay, and in addition to that, because we have perpendicular diagonals, these angles, or these triangles that are created inside, are going to be right triangles, which then allow me to also apply the Pythagorean theorem in addition to that. So a lot of information all tied up in these very special quadrilaterals that we're looking at.